Hello, and welcome to the Legacy Instructional Series. I'm Splen from Legacy Fleet, and I'm here to tell you everything you need to know about the single most popular game mode in Star Citizen, racing. By the end of this video, you'll be a champion drifter. Arena Commander Racing is one of the oldest game modes in Star Citizen. It has a low entry barrier but a steep learning curve for mastery, making it appealing to all pilot skill levels. Furthermore, racing is a great way to learn about and practice some of the more complicated aspects of piloting. This video will explain every aspect of racing so you can keep up with the pros. We'll cover ship selection and loadout, controls, track knowledge, racing technique, and advanced maneuvers. A quick note before we get started, this video does not cover scramble racing, which is a mission type in the Persistent universe that is more like a drag race with guns. This video is about Arena Commander Racing, which is more like F1 in 3 dimensions and no gravity and no guns. What makes a good racing ship? Star Citizen narrows down the choices by marking certain ships as designed for racing, such as the Mustang Gamma, the Misk Razor, and the Origin Jumpworks M50. However, certain specifications vary from patch to patch, so you'll have to do a little research to figure out which ship is the best. Load up your favorite ship comparison tool and get ready to take some notes. In order of importance, here are the most desirable stats of a good racing ship. Forward thrust. Forward thrust creates forward acceleration, which is obviously important to racing. Compared to all other thrusters on a racing ship, the main thrusters provide the most directional thrust out of all thrusters by a considerable margin, making them often the ideal thrusters to use for adjusting a ship's vector of motion. Of course, you need to change where these thrusters are pointing in order to adjust your motion vector correctly, which brings us to our next most important stat. Turning thrust. Turning thrusters drive the pitch and yaw of your ship. For a beginner and intermediate racer, the yaw thrusters are marginally more important, but both directions will become critical as you advance. Next is backward thrust. Backward or retro thrusters are used almost as often as forward thrust in a race. The more powerful these thrusters are, the less time you need to brake before a tight turn. Shifting from engines for a moment, the most important stat is cooling efficiency. While the mechanics of thruster heat in Star Citizen have changed from patch to patch, they are extremely important to consider in racing since you'll be using your afterburners very frequently. Afterburning generates lots of heat, and overheated thrusters will shut down for a few seconds, causing you to lose control in that direction. We'll talk more about heat management later in this video. Cooling efficiency is controlled by cooler components. Different ships can carry different amounts and sizes of these components, but for racing, you're likely going to be using the size 1 variety. Check your favorite datasheet to determine which components are right for you, but in general, those that have low mass and good heat dissipation are your best options. Your next important stat is strafing thrusters, which means all other directional thrust that we haven't covered yet. These are thrusters that move your ship laterally and vertically along your ship's rotational vector. Depending on the patch, these thrusters may be more or less important as the flight model changes. We'll cover their usage in the advanced section at the end of this video. Finally, top speed. It may seem odd for top speed to be the least important stat for racing, but as of Alpha Patch 3.8, only 3 racing tracks exist in Arena Commander, and I've never needed to reach anywhere near top speed. In fact, if you're ever at top speed, you're probably making a big mistake and will greatly overshoot your next turn. As of 3.8, the ship with the best stats according to the list I described is the M50. If you don't have the best ship for a particular patch, use your judgment and pick the best possible ship that you own for this purpose. Now that you've picked a good ship, go to Arena Commander and edit the ship's loadout. If you've rented your ship using the Arena Commander currency, REC, you may be unable to edit your ship's loadout due to CIG's current policy. If you own the ship by buying it with real money, you should be good to proceed. In general, remove everything from your ship that's not going to be used in racing. This includes shields, guns, missiles and racks, quantum drive, and possibly more items as the game develops. Keep your coolers on, however, and if possible, equip, rent, or buy the best ones available for you. Check your favorite Star Citizen datasheet to see which coolers are the best for your ship's component size. Some components cannot be rented and only become available if you own a ship that has them equipped by default. Some homework will be required to figure out exactly how to get what you need. So why do these loadout changes matter? The point is that it might not matter at all, and indeed, in some patches it made a difference, and in some it did not. A better question to ask is why not? In a truly realistic scenario, unneeded components only add extra weight to your ship and could potentially take power or heat sinking away from thrusters, which will negatively affect your racing. There's no harm in taking these components off, so do so, if possible. Before jumping into racing, you should have some familiarity with how flight controls work for the current patch. For ship thruster control, we're going to stick to a general rule: analog controls are better. This means that joysticks, pedals, and throttles will give you far more precise control over your ship's movement than keyboard keys or other digital buttons. Your most important analog bindings, if possible, should be your ship's pitch, yaw, and forward-backward thrust. The most common choices to achieve this are a dual joystick or joystick and throttle setup, but ultimately, the choices boil down to preference. You should have the Afterburner button bound to a key that can be reached at all times, such as a joystick trigger or thumb button. You may also want to bind an easy-to-reach button to toggle weapons and shield systems if you can't remove these components from your ship entirely. Other useful bindings include power priority to engines, if power availability is not abundant for your ship, and self-destruct, which is a faster method to get back on track in certain situations. We'll cover this in more detail later on. As of patch 3.8, there are 3 racing tracks in Arena Commander. Old Vanderval is a quick race with gradual, easy turns and is good for beginners. It takes about a minute to get through it once you're good. Reichard Memorial takes about a minute and a half to get through and has some significantly sharper turns with more obstacles than Old Van. Finally, Defertlink is a whopper of a track that takes around 2.5 minutes to get through. It has a little bit of everything from nasty sharp turns with deadly consequences to enormous, gradual NASCAR loops that will test your G-force and speed management. All of these tracks have been in the game for years with very little changes, and as such, there's a lot of shortcuts and tricks to getting the best times on each. At first, take things slow. Load up the races in single player and explore. Get used to the track and gradually speed things up. It's also a really good idea to watch good racers. Get involved with a racing organization, or just hang out in Arena Commander multiplayer and try to keep up with the pros. You can learn a lot about the best routes and ships, just by observing others. Now that we've got the basics covered, we're going to start getting into the finer points of racing. By now, you should have taken a few laps on each track and picked your best racing ship and components. Your controls, as well as the current flight model, are very comfortable to you. Without any additional help, you are able to get through the 3 tracks in the times I mentioned in the last section, and now you're ready to push yourself to the limit. First things first, turn off G-Safe, which is a setting that limits your ship's thrust to keep your pilot from losing vision or passing out. This is done in the options menu or by a toggle switch. I recommend having it off all the time. Why? The built-in system is too heavy-handed and will hinder your flying once you get really good, and a good pilot can manage their G-force exposure manually. Check out this video from Legacy Instructional Series that offers ways to manage G-forces correctly. Once you've got G-Safe off, get used to the tracks again, because it's going to probably feel a bit different. Practice managing your G-force exposure around the crazy turns while keeping on track. You'll find yourself rolling the ship in different ways and having to get used to seeing the track from different angles. Take your time, and once you feel comfortable again, we'll move on to the next point. Now, let's talk for a moment about speed management. As of patch 3.8, you could limit your speed with a toggle and set a maximum directional velocity for your ship. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you're probably going to never actually go max speed in your ship on any track, and if you do, you're probably doing something wrong and are going to really overshoot your next turn. To mitigate this, you can use the speed limiter, but I advise against it. Why? It's another subsystem that you need to fine-tune while racing. And believe me when I say you want your attention focused elsewhere.
Garfield.
My advice is to turn off the speed limiter completely in the options menu. Instead of using the limiter, practice managing your speed by watching where you're at and getting a feel for the track and your ship. Certain tracks can be tackled at different speeds. Practice and patience will pay off in dividends. Your most powerful tool to keeping your speed in check is afterburning thrusters, especially your main thrusters. However, you need to be able to turn the ship as fast as possible as well as manage heat of individual thrusters to do this with the most efficiency. Also remember that you can use multiple maneuvering thrusters simultaneously to change both your motion vector and directional vector faster, which can help you from overshooting turns. Check out these links from Legacy Instructional Series detailing why and how to use multiple thrusters in your turns. For the next point, we're going to talk about where your eyes should be when they're not looking at the speedometer. Most of the time, you're going to be looking at where your velocity indicator is in relation to the track. That's this little thing right here. There are actually two of them, one showing the front vector and one showing the rear vector. Obviously, we're interested in the front-facing one. You should always know where the TVI is, which can be very challenging depending on the color of your HUD and the color of the sky. The TVI shows what direction your ship is currently moving in, regardless of where your nose is pointing. You want to use your thrusters to keep the TVI from pointing at obstacles, because that means you're going to crash into that obstacle. You should be directing the TVI around turns and through the next checkpoint ring. Doing this can be challenging when you're trying to use your ship's main thrusters to cut a fast turn, which can cause the TVI to be out of your field of view momentarily. When you can't see your TVI, you don't know exactly where you're going, and that can lead to disaster. So how do we mitigate this? As of patch 3.8, there are a few ways. Adjusting your FOV to be very large and getting a nice, wide monitor certainly helps and is the most comfortable option for newer pilots. As you get better at racing, you'll find that this is still not enough for some extreme situations. One way to fix this is to use the look-ahead options in the settings menu. The slider you'll be most interested in is the velocity vector. Slide this to the desired level and also slide the other ones to lower settings or off completely. You will find that your pilot's head will now constantly try to track the velocity vector, which will be jarring at first, but soon you'll get used to it. But before you do, there's one more option to consider: head tracking. Now we're getting a little complex, since there's multiple hardware solutions applicable here, such as infrared tracking, the built-in faceware solution, which requires a webcam, or even virtual reality headsets for those immune to nausea. How you approach this is up to you, as there's also an incredible amount of settings to adjust, but once you have a comfortable head tracking solution in place, it is hands down the most accurate way to track the velocity indicator, and also gives you full control of the pilot's head, which can be used to track multiple things at once more efficiently. Now, I'm not going to commit to saying that head tracking or even look ahead is 100% needed, as sufficient track knowledge and extreme practice can mitigate collisions pretty effectively. For those that prefer the static view, here's some points to consider. If you can't track the TVI manually or automatically, doing lateral turns will help keep it on your screen, as monitors are wider than they are tall. Remember, however, that your fastest turns require both up-down and left-right directional thrusters to fire at once, so your overall turns will be slower when using only lateral turns. Also, even if you're using head tracking, consider that ship cockpit viewing area varies widely between ships. Some ships, like the M50, have a huge blind spot of anything lower than the ship's nose in any direction, while other ships have far better views of their surroundings. Keep these facts in mind when planning a turn, as your TVI can drift to your blind spots if you turn in certain directions, leaving you unaware of what's in your ship's path. Next, we'll get a little deeper into afterburning and heat management. As of the flight model in patch 3.8, afterburning is critical to your success as a pilot, as most of your ship's thrusters become much more powerful when afterburning. You can change velocity and direction about twice as fast while using afterburners. However, using afterburners for sustained periods generates heat, which can take a while to decay from your ship's individual thrusters. If a thruster gets too hot, it will shut off completely, which is nearly always disastrous in a race. With practice, you can manage heat efficiently in a race by learning what parts of a track benefit from afterburning and which parts could do without. Also, as I mentioned before, make sure your cooler components are the best available to make your heat dissipate faster. I often find myself feathering the afterburner button in certain situations instead of holding it down in order to not generate as much heat. Be precise with afterburning and use auditory and visual cues to know when things are getting too hot. The heat system in Star Citizen has changed dramatically from patch to patch, so keep abreast of how the current flight model works in order to properly manage your heat. Finally, let's talk a bit about death. In the racing game mode, you're going to tear wings off of your ship and sometimes smash components and thrusters without blowing up. This can be problematic to your performance, and since there's no pit stops or repair opportunities, it's probably better to just kill yourself. It sounds shocking and morbid, but as of patch 3.8, self-destructing takes merely a couple seconds in Arena Commander racing, making your death and subsequent miraculous resurrection in a brand new ship quick and painless. Self-destruction can also be much better for your overall race time if you veer too far off course. Get this button bound to something easy to reach, because you'll be committing ship seppuku very often. At last, the final section of this tutorial has arrived. Before continuing, practice all the points covered in the last section. By now, you're feeling pretty hot. You're the envy of average Joe racers, and you frequently win in multiplayer. You deliver the tofu, and it's still warm. You don't spill your drink around turns. You're able to easily surpass the racing times I mentioned earlier in the video, and you're looking for absolutely every little edge you can get in order to shave off milliseconds. Well, look no further. You're probably wondering why I mentioned strafing thrusters at the beginning of the video and then completely ignored them. That's because they're largely unimportant in racing and requires management of yet another ship subsystem, making it just a complication for beginners and even intermediates. But if you really want to dish it all out, you can use them in niche ways. By default, when your ship is in coupled control mode, your strafing thrusters automatically fire to try and move the velocity indicator to where your ship's nose is pointing. This motion dampening is mostly sufficient and helpful during the race, but not always. You can manually fire your strafing thrusters to fine-tune where the TVI should go, which is especially helpful if you've got two close together turns and you want to continue maneuvering your ship in a certain way, but point the main thrusters somewhere else. I often find myself strafing to adjust my TVI in a really sharp turn where I've already pointed my nose toward the next ring. You can also strafe in the opposite direction of G-stress in order to help mitigate G-forces if you can't rotate fast enough. While this is an emergency situation that is often detrimental to your racing time, it could stop your pilot from passing out. Finally, what happens if you completely turn off all strafing thrusters except for manual control? This is called decoupled mode. You can switch between coupled and decoupled mode with a keybind, and for racing, you'll probably want it as a hold rather than a toggle, since you should only be decoupled for small amounts of time. unless you're a pilot demon who can race with only manual thruster control. But for us mortals, this technique can be helpful in certain situations. For example, if you're approaching a sharp turn and have your TVI lined up perfectly, you can decouple to keep your TVI steady while turning the ship, then recouple after the ring to start thrusting toward your next checkpoint. Keep in mind that while you're decoupled, unless you're firing thrusters manually, you will not be slowing down at all, making it easy to accidentally overshoot turns. In decoupled mode, none of your thrusters are firing, and therefore they are all cooling down as fast as possible. With lots and lots of practice, flying decoupled can shave some hairs off your racing time in very specific turns. And now, fledgling, we have reached the end of the Legacy Instructional Series racing tutorial. Leave the nest and experience capillary-bursting, stroke-inducing G-forces to your heart's content. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, learning to race has served me well in other aspects of Star Citizen, such as combat and even emergency navigation of larger ships. You can cut turns faster, save fuel, and outmaneuver your foes with your superior understanding of vector control. Go now and prevail.